I'm about to introduce you a man who doesn't need an introduction. His name is Dechert. By knowing him, I got introduced to what I would call the spirit of old New York. Argumentative, loud, brash, well thought through, entertaining way of communicating your thoughts that is almost lost in today's culture.
Good to see you, as always.
Good to see you, Doug. So here's a little story that we're going to dedicate some time, and we hope that the story will be to your liking. And Doug, you decided to invite the viewers, including the viewers of my channel. Sur was Yura. Sur comes from surreal, because I kind of give a twist to the news that surround us that are nothing short of surreal. The conversation we plan to have today that you proposed was about what went wrong with the sexual revolution that everybody liked so much.
Indeed.
In the beginning, yeah.
So what went wrong with it? I'll tell you. In order to understand what went wrong with the sexual revolution, we have to go back a couple hundred years. For starters, we have to look at just before the Industrial Revolution, at the archetype of the end of classicism when it came to the relations between men and women. Before there was a middle class, for instance, in England, during the Regency period, we had Jane Austen, one of whose books, Pride and Prejudice, is illustrative of how things used to be. And I call it, Where's Darcy? Because before there was a middle class, the landed gentry that were the equivalent, or upper middle class today, and the aristocracy had one thought in mind for their girls. How to marry up, how to marry the richest, best provider. As in Darcy. Well, the concept is also known as hypergamy, and it goes both ways for men and women. Hypergamy is about the best possible match. For women, the richest guy. For men, the most beautiful and possibly status-activated bride. So, in Jane Austen's England, that's all there was. Literally, that's all there was. There wasn't a middle class per se. There were some shopkeepers, and Alexis de Tocqueville called England a nation of shopkeepers, which was pre-industrial age middle class. And that kind of defines to Tocqueville the mentality of England. So it was all about making good marriages. That's always been true throughout the ages, throughout the millennia. But as the industrial age developed, we had enough money floating around to grow a middle class, not just shopkeepers, but urban professionals, etc. Without getting too much into that, from, let's say, 1820 to 1920, in Western civilization, we developed an actual middle class. And that middle class grew families in environments socially that allowed for raising children in a traditional way, with mostly religious moral values and a kind of a tight social boundary mechanism for behavior. Now, that grew in the early 20th century. By the 1920s, when we had the roaring 20s, the economy was booming. We had the birth of suburbs. We had the growth in America and in Europe at the same time of this burgeoning middle class that had social standards, behavior, and sexuality. Now, modern people tend to think that the social strictures of this long period were too confining, were too restrictive. Whatever. In any case, moving forward, if we get to the end of World War II, we had a huge demand for marriage and children, what the economists call pent-up demand. So we had this explosion of family formation from ex-vets in America, particularly with the GI Bill. We had veterans forming immediate families, millions of them, all over America.
The year 1950 is considered the most prosperous year in the 20th century for the United States.
Decade plus, from say 48. There were some economic downturns, but we don't need to get into all the graphology of the economics. The 50s through the early 60s were a huge growth economically, huge growth of family income. It was just constant growth, and it allowed for the formation of huge families that were prosperous all over America, the growth of huge suburbs, crime-free pretty much. The living was easy as long as the paterfamilias had a good job.
And let's not forget one important thing. It was also the advent of the television. So the success became a norm, sort of. When you look at this on television, you want to be there on your TV set. Right.
It's true. TV and mass media, magazines, publishing affected the culture. And as Andrew Breitbart said, everything flows downstream from the culture. That's a paraphrase, but it's a good thing to remember. Now, the 50s were so successful that it's one of my themes that success breeds failure. And I'll explain. Now, because of the baby boom and because of mass media, including television, magazines, and the music industry, all of the media catered to the needs, the wants, and the proclivities of small children starting in the early 50s. And as they grew in this demographic bubble called the baby boom, media and entertainment followed their urges. So by the early 60s, for instance, music became about their interests, as in early rock and roll. Early in the 50s, rock and roll was kind of rockabilly in America, which was adult music, although it catered to the kind of ideas that kids were interested in. Basically, driving and courtship. By the 60s, it developed into this monster as this huge baby boom wound up determining the culture. Adolescence in the 60s determined the whole culture in the early 60s. As those adolescents grew through the educational system that was already influenced by the generations-long standing of Marxist influences in both schools and colleges. By the late 60s, the revolution came. And the revolution was spearheaded and fomented by young people. Let's say baby boom 18-year-olds. 18-year-olds who were prone to their hormonal urges and thus free love. Well, free love was fun to be around. I was there in the late 60s as an adolescent in Manhattan. It was an interesting, fun time. But it also led to revolution in every way. We had the Vietnam War, which we shouldn't have been in, but that's another story. But being in the Vietnam War gave a real spur to revolution among draft age young people for all the obvious reasons. Who the hell would want to go to war? Okay? Especially in places that most people couldn't even find on a map or a globe. Well, that revolutionary spirit intersected with free love. So I'm here to talk about the sexual revolution, so I'm going to stay on that subject.
So where would you put the first mark? You mentioned Jane Austen, right?
Yeah.
And then
that was before the sexual revolution.
Yeah, but you kind of give the retrospective of
because of hypergamy, because of the need 200 years ago, one crucial need: marry up. Well, that was when marriage was really important. By the time where we've gotten to just now, the late 60s, marriage was among young people not a big deal. Illegitimate pregnancy by the late 60s became common, if not encouraged. It started becoming common. If you want to look at demographics, in the 50s, while we had the baby boom and this so-called thought of by revolutionaries, the stultifying age of strictures, shibboleths and limitations on behavior in the 50s that radicals were rebelling against, starting with the beatniks, etc., Jack Kerouac, etc. We had this philosophical revolution in the 50s against these strictures, and illegitimacy among bourgeois middle-class people all over America was somewhere around 5 to 8%. While comparatively, Black Americans who were joining the middle class had a relatively low rate of illegitimacy in the 50s, somewhere around 16 to 20%, higher than the bourgeois average, but not that much higher, and frowned upon in their communities. Well, illegitimacy became an issue during the beginnings of the sexual revolution in the 60s. And this is an important point, because the Democrat Party needed to find a way to get Black voters, and their answer under Lyndon Johnson was the Great Society, which literally was a bribe to potential Black voters who the Democrat Party was losing because of its 100+ years of association with Jim Crow, slavery, etc. The Democrat Party was the party of slavery. The Republican Party back in 1860 was the anti-slavery party. Under Lincoln, the Republican Party tried to bring Black citizens into the Republican Party as legitimate voters, and the Democrat Party fought tooth and nail, founded the Ku Klux Klan, which was active through the 1920s and even the 30s. the Democrat Party needed to change up its game in terms of recruiting black voters. So they went after urban black voters in the 1960s by trying to bribe them with aid to families with dependent children, because the Democrat Party knew in the early 60s that while the black American illegitimacy rate was very low by contemporary standards, was still a little higher than the white illegitimacy rate. And they literally said, we're just going to give them money and drive them into our Democrat Party plantation by bribing them with aid to families with dependent children. And what that meant, because aid to families with dependent children meant that black women in particular were being singled out to be paid to have bastards, because they couldn't get money under aid to families with dependent children if they were married. And that absolutely destroyed the black family, starting in the early mid-60s.
Do you think it was pre-planned, or it was
absolutely
like a side effect of
absolutely
good intentions, quote unquote?
One wishes that everybody had good intentions, but it's easily researchable that Democrat Party leaders said, we're going to hook these people on social welfare and we'll get them voting for us forever. Those policies of the so-called Great Society with aid to families with dependent children
looks very good on a shelf.
Looks like it's good intentions, but it was really using public money to grow the voter rolls of the Democrat Party in every city in America. I can get back to that later, but it was a disaster for black Americans.
For most people in this segment, it took the pursuit of property out of the equation. You have the money that you need.
Permanent
you don't
dependence.
need to own anything.
Permanent dependence.
And same thing they're telling us now.
And if you get married, you're going to lose your welfare aid. And now we just call it welfare. You're going to lose your welfare if you get married. You won't be eligible for welfare if you get married. And that blew up starting in the early mid-60s. It blew up the black American illegitimacy rate, which had a concomitant downstream effect going into the future on everybody in America. So that's part of the sexual revolution. Illegitimacy is part of that. So the Great Society's effect on black illegitimacy rates, black Americans' illegitimacy rates, which was disastrous for the formation of black families because they couldn't get the AFDIC money if the mothers got married, had profound reciprocal effects on the nation in general. At this time, white Americans' illegitimacy rates were climbing because of the free love movement and the beginnings of feminism, which said women are just like men. They can do whatever they want, and they should eschew any social boundaries, religious doctrine.
What about the conservatives at the time? Were they caught with, so to speak, their pants down by all this explosion in 1964? Well, they were part of it and tried to accommodate it for the conservative part of the population.
Bill Buckley was probably the primary espouser of conservative values, and he, of course, decried the sexual license and its effect on illegitimacy rates during the 60s and the 70s. But tragically, conservatives gave up the culture in any meaningful sense in terms of having any influence on the culture starting in the 60s and through the 70s and the 80s. They just became irrelevant because the way the culture works, well, culture is influenced by media. And I've been working in the media as a newspaper reporter and a magazine columnist and an editor for longer than I want to state, but going back a long time. And what I realized a long time ago is that the media cares about one thing: sensationalism. And that's rational because sensationalism brings eyeballs. I get that. But sensationalism by itself is unethical and amoral in terms of reportage. So the media is always in the business of allying itself with whoever is pushing the boundaries of outrage farther. And that's always going to be the left. The media is philosophically uninterested in rational answers to the pushing of the boundaries to the obscene in the left. So the media never gives rational, philosophical, and ethical positions credence because the media, in general, judges that not to be sensational enough to be interesting to draw viewers and eyeballs. So it's not exactly a rigged game for the left versus the right, but it's an uneven match because the boundaries always go left. Tragically, every time the boundaries move left, they've never in my lifetime moved back towards the center even. Ever. Just doesn't happen.
Like any
the
good
new center just constantly is to the left.
They pull the center toward themselves.
And it never moves back. The center is always left-tropic, if you will. So back to the point. The feminists got on board with all of this. The feminists were in fact allies as hard leftists, as radicals, as Marxists. I mean, the leaders of feminism in the 60s, certainly the 70s, Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, and a list of god-awful names I won't recite at this moment, were all Marxists, every one of them. They didn't tell the public that, but that was their stock in trade. So they were basically anti-American, anti-family. They said we're anti-patriarchal. What they were is anti-family and anti-basically white fathers of families. In the 70s, we had what I experienced. I was in prep school and college in those days. God damn, it was a good time to be a young bachelor. By the late 70s, I was full-on card-carrying beneficiary of the feminist version of free love, which wasn't the hippie version in 1968 and 78. It was if you had the energy to leave your apartment and go to a bar, you could come home with a new, and if your standards were high enough, a new pretty girl. You don't even know their names back then. And in the morning, they'd use your landline because we didn't have cell phones back then. And they would call up their best friend and brag about how much fun they had with the guy whose name they probably didn't know. And I'm not bragging. It's just the way it was for me and all of my friends and peers. That's how it worked. It was wonderful to be a bachelor. I've evolved since then for a lot of reasons, and I'll get to that later. But boy, as a horny, hormone-infested young guy in that period, it was a paradise.
Was it, of course, physiologically natural for you, being of certain age, and it went back to culture, it went back to the movies, and then it amplified the whole process. And the next iteration.
I don't think for 2,000 years any guy from 18 to 28 has needed the culture to inspire him to be sexually active. It's hormonal.
You may not realize it too.
Well,
in general,
there's a lot of cultural influence that one doesn't necessarily take into account consciously.
Yeah.
But the culture also encouraged this for young men and young women at the time. The movies just elevated.
Then what happened? It was so good. It was so good, why it ended?
I'll tell you what happened. By the mid-'80s, and members of the audience can easily Google this. By 1985, the good times were rolling, but there were some demographic shifts. The marriage rates plummeted. And I'm not making this up. I knew guys my age all the way up to 20 years old said, who wants to get married? We're all getting laid like rock stars. And we were. Guys 20 years older. All you had to do was go out. So marriage rates plummeted. And two indices happened. Around 85, 86, when Newsweek was a top circulation print magazine, there was a cover on Newsweek that had a kind of illustrative painting, simple, kind of like a Hopper painting of a woman about 30 sitting in a chair in a vaguely empty room with a window in the background. And the headline on the cover of Newsweek said, "This 30-year-old woman has a greater chance of being hit by lightning than getting married." And that was statistical.
Was it an exaggeration, or it was statistical?
This was a statistical truth. And I'm never going to say Newsweek is the be-all and end-all of truth, but they were hitting on something. Around the same time, the leaders of the feminist movement, like the execrable Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, and others, were on stage in front of members of their following in the National Organization of Women, NOW, and the members in the audience were shouting them down and booing, literally yelling, "We've got jobs, but we can't nobody's marrying us." So the feminist leaders knew they had a problem. And one of their problems is that they really didn't want to walk back, have sex like men, because then they'd have to admit that that was a mistake. But along came the so-called AIDS crisis. Well, the homosexual lobby, which I from now on will just refer to as sodomites, because it's a biblical term and it's not even that pejorative. It's just a term.
It's the name of the city.
It's a name of an activity.
No, it's Sodom.
Sodom
exists until today.
Well, I'll get back to Sodom in a minute.
Okay.
I will, when we get to the wisdom of the ancients. So, the feminist leadership had a big problem with their membership, which was huge, in the millions. Members of NOW, recorded, Googleable, millions of them. And they were angry. They were angry that feminist policies were good for getting jobs. Keep that, because irritation is one of my skill sets too. Now, where were we? They had jobs, but they couldn't get husbands because they were fucking like rats, okay? And it was good because I was there. But the feminists knew they had to solve that problem. And lo and behold, AIDS came up. And what became their natural allies, the future LGBT gang, which was desperate for money to finance their organization, said, oh my God, this gay plague isn't just for gays, it's for heterosexuals too. Well, that was absolute bullshit. The chances statistically for 10 years straight and on of a heterosexual that wasn't an IV drug user and didn't have open sores due to some disease were nil. The AIDS lobby tried for 10 years to find a single example of a heterosexual getting AIDS from another heterosexual from sex that didn't have open sores or was an IV drug user. They could never find one. However, the feminist leadership said, this is perfect for us. They allied with the then LGBT leadership, and the two groups said to the public, with the blessing of Anthony Fauci, who completely mismanaged the AIDS problem, such as it was. By the way, the same guy that genocided millions of Americans and other citizens of Western Civ, but without getting into all of Anthony Fauci's genocidal policies, the feminists and the LGBT groups got together to say two things. AIDS is a heterosexual problem. Feminists love that, and I'll explain. Two, we have to give money to the LGBT groups because of AIDS, which is everybody's problem. To wit, Liz Taylor instantly jumping on the bandwagon for huge AIDS fundraisers. The feminists were on board because they could then say to their disaffected followers, well, we were right to tell you to fuck like rabbits, but now it's time to put your knees together because now you could die from a disease that could kill you. And they could do that without saying we were wrong philosophically or ethically. It's just now things have changed, so stop fucking like rabbits. Well, that came to pass around 1988, 89, and that's when I had a gorgeous live-in girlfriend for 8 years. Good timing, right? But that's just the beginning of the end. By the 90s, women were not just entering parity in the workforce. By the 1990s, women comprised more than 50% of undergraduates in college. Women comprised well over 50% in graduate schools in college, including MBA. Not so much in engineering and STEM back then because of disparities in skill sets, but certainly from teachers' colleges, graduate level, which you needed to get a license to teach in American schools, but all the soft social sciences. Women outnumbered men in graduate schools overwhelmingly. And that was the beginning of the end. after 100 years of Marxists in secondary education, colleges. I mean, this is it. Women took over colleges and graduate schools in the so-called soft sciences.
But still, it looks like it wasn't nearly a dent in the system of patriarchy, as feminists would describe it. They were still unhappy with this.
The myth of patriarchy. The myth. Feminists by the 70s were...
Most of what we're talking about are myths.
Yes, of course.
Just
by the 90s, feminists were publicly decrying that CEOs were still mostly white patriarchs. Well, that's because to get to the level of a CEO, it takes 20 some odd years, maybe more, to get to that level. And women had been in graduate schools, MBA, law school, by the 90s for about 10 or at most 15 years in any appreciable numbers. Since the mid-90s, huge, overwhelming lopsided percentages in MBA law and basically every other graduate level soft garbage. So in the 90s, they were saying it's unfair because of outcomes. And that's the whole diversity, inclusive, equity bullshit of it's about outcomes, not equal playing field. Well, in the 90s, women hadn't had these degrees long enough to percolate to CEO level. Well, today, 30 years later, they're all over the place. Everywhere in the Fortune 500. And DC and the permanent state, the deep state in every administration. Right. But we'll get to that in a minute. So, the feminists allied with the LGBT, I like to say LGBT QWERTY because there are so many letters, it sounds like the keyboard on my laptop. They allied, and that is an evil union that we've been stuck with ever since, because what it led to is the pure expression of Satanism. Once again, Breitbart, the culture, everything flows downhill. Well, let's take a look at the culture. The media. For instance, Disney, one of the biggest corporations in America. It owns so much media. It isn't just Barbie or whatever. Disney is, I think they own ABC or NBC, whatever. ABC. They're all the same. Disney owns big media that influences all the regular people in America that have no time to study what's going on. They just take their morning TV and their evening news from big media. And that's all they got time for. They have families, they got jobs, etc. For a little side note, 80% of the women in America get all their news from morning television. Literally. They're busy, most of them are moms. They're breakfast, they're making lunch, they got the TV in the background. And these are influential to the women of America. God knows how any decent candidate ever gets a vote with these harridans spewing lies and bullshit at them all morning long, which is when they're listening to news. The alliance between the feminists and the LGBT QWERTY gang back during the so-called AIDS crisis led to the end of the Bachelor's Paradise, because all of a sudden Well, like I said, I wound up living with a beautiful actress model for 8 years. And God, I almost got married, but that's another story. From there on in, it was over for bachelors that aren't billionaires. But what happened is that the landscape changed in the work environment and for families. Because by the early 90s, women weren't just in the workforce. Women had to be in the workforce, even if they were married. Because when you dilute the workforce of, say, 1959 or 65, think Mad Men, with 50% or roughly of women in managerial positions, any economist will tell you that a surfeit of so-called skilled credential labor means that the wages and compensation of men when they're competing with women for top quality jobs is going to be diluted by, in my opinion, roughly 50%, because 50% dilution in the workforce. And what that means is that by the 90s, it was the beginning of no longer could there be a single income nuclear family with the paterfamilias bringing home the bacon, the mom raising the kids according to their ideological, theological ideals. All of a sudden, just like the powers that be wanted, without the mom at home, the mom having to work, the kids were being indoctrinated in the schools by the 90s. Now, initially, that didn't look too bad, because in the 90s, we didn't have what we've had since then, which is the teachers' unions, where teachers have to have graduate degrees, and the teachers' colleges don't teach teachers how to teach math, science, or even English lit better. They indoctrinate teachers with essentially Marxism. So all of a sudden, the moms are in the workforce 40 hours a week. The kids are victims of the constantly farther left programming in the grade schools, in the high schools. And the effects have been felt ever since then. Furthermore, because by the 90s, a huge percentage of American families had moms working, even though I would posit that most moms in America that aren't determined to have a career and fulfill their egotistical dreams of relevance in careers would have preferred to be at home raising the kids as they should be. They had to be working to support the family while the kids are being indoctrinated in the schools. And that was the beginning of the end of the American family. That was in the 90s. The divorce rate skyrocketed, particularly in the sector where the wives had stressful careers because they were going to grad school, they had relatively powerful jobs, and all of a sudden they were coming home stressed out instead of nurturing their stressed out husbands that needed the 50s type pipe and slippers and a warm, well-cooked meal waiting for them. Well, divorce rates went through the roof. And marriage rates have plummeted too, accordingly, but divorce rates skyrocketed. starting in the 90s, the average marriage lasted about 6 years. Now, that's a disaster for children. There's hard science. Our audience can look this up. A happy marriage has the greatest likelihood of productive, centered kids that do well in life. An unhappy marriage, which is common and has always been common going back hundreds of years, not quite as good an outcome statistically with the offspring as a happy marriage, but still pretty high because at least they're married and the kids can rationalize their parents' problems. But then down the road, statistically, comes divorced parents. By the 70s, when the divorce rate was skyrocketing into the 80s and the 90s, outcomes for children of divorce rates with mental illness, every kind of neurosis, every kind of mental problem, skyrocketed from being the kids of divorced parents. Kids from divorced families have documented, look it up, all kinds of self-confidence issues. It's a fact. Nobody can deny it. All kinds of relationship issues because of trust issues. Mom and dad couldn't be with each other. For girls, very important for girls, it's dad issues. For boys, they get their own matrix of problems mentally. This is all documented, and that's just from divorces. Then you get to the single mom, illegitimate children factor. Enormous statistical problems with that, which the feminists and this society have been pushing that for 40 years. But the outcomes mentally for children of unmarried single mothers, fucking disastrous. And so on. Never mind getting into what I'm going to start referring to as sodomite families. And now I'm going to slide over tangentially into the LGBT gang, which I will refer to as just sodomites. For me, sodomites refers to all of it. Sodomites includes what today we talk about: trannies, transvestites. I'm not even going to refer to drag queens because they're just transvestites promoting transvestitism. God knows you got the corporate profit disaster of that thing Mulvaney, that nasty, ugly thing. It's all sodomites and sodomite trannies. I'm just going to call them all sodomites. Well, the sodomites have an agenda. An agenda is simple. They got into the culture saying, we just want to be accepted. We just want acceptance. That was bullshit.
There was never non-acceptance, by the way, historically.
Well, historically in the 50s,
Jorzan dressed as a man.
If you go back 7 years, they weren't accepted. And if you go back to England, as recently as the 50s, it was against the law. They could go to prison. Oscar Wilde went to prison in the 1920s.
Still, at the time, it was referred to as an English disease or British disease,
Well,
right?
the British are prone to that because of their class system, but that's the subject of a whole other podcast.
No, absolutely. I'm just saying that there is just a matter of forcing you to accept it. It's not that it's some sort of a struggle.
The feminists and the sodomites teamed up in the 80s and 90s to force us to take it on the chin and
force
go along.
Is the key
Cultural
notion
force.
there.
Breitbart. Culture determines everything. They got in and they've been forcing us to accept sodomy for 40 years. And it isn't about acceptance. It's about always, like I said, pushing the boundaries constantly to the point where, I don't know, 20 years ago, they got it so scoutmasters could be sodomites. So the Boy Scouts and the Catholic Church were infiltrated. Catholic Church came first because of celibacy, but the Boy Scouts, back in the 90s, there's a big deal with the LGBT movement on we have equality so we can be scoutmasters. And scoutmasters wound up being in pup tents in the woods with their charges. And all of a sudden, the Boy Scouts became full of sexual abuse lawsuits. And at the same time, the Catholic Church had issues going back before LGBT, but for similar reasons. But by the 90s, the Catholic Church had big problems. Ultimately, the Boy Scouts are done. I'm not sure if they even exist anymore from the lawsuits because of all the pedophilia issues in the Boy Scouts. Now, as far as the Catholic Church goes, before I go on, Pope Benedict, God bless him, was a good pope. And when he started saying, I'm going to get to the bottom of the pedophilia in the Catholic Church, Obama was in office. And Obama used the power of the United States deep state to pressure the Catholic Church in Rome to get rid of Pope Benedict. They threatened Pope Benedict with saying, when you were a kid in Germany, you were a member of the Hitler Youth, and we are going to drum this on you unless you resign. As far as I know, no pope had ever resigned before. They die in office. They pushed Pope Benedict out of office while he was on the verge of doing a papal inquisition on sodomite pedophilia in the Catholic Church, which had already been exposed by Spotlight in Boston at that point and all over the world.
This was basically demanded by all the feminists and LGBTQ and everybody else.
Everybody wanted the Catholic Church to fess up. But when Pope Benedict said, we're gonna actually get into it, Obama, who was a fucking sodomite in his own right and wanted to destroy the Catholic Church, got his powers together and forced Benedict to abdicate, which, as far as I know, has never happened, in favor of the Argentine communist, John, whatever his name is, the anti-pope, who's a communist. And that anti-pope, since then, stopped all the legitimate inquisition of the sodomite infiltration of the Catholic Church. But we'll get to the meaning of that shortly. Where was I? The LGBT infiltration of everything, every good institution, Boy Scouts, Catholic Church, and teaching, pedagogy. Pedagogy became pedophilia with LGBT infiltration. It, at first, 30 years ago, they said, oh no, it's okay to have sodomite teachers because they're not going to proselytize, they're not going to groom. That was 30 years ago. Well, what we've got now is open grooming of children down to preschool with, I'm not even going to use the term, what I will call transvestite groomers. That's the bewigged, makeup-wearing, I'm not going to call them men, just sodomites, grooming children in preschool, in every state fair, in every public forum that's meant to be normal public forums. Never mind every parade on earth, in every city, in every town in America that features bare buttocks of naked or at least semi-naked men in parades in leather bondage outfits.
You're talking about Folsom Street Parade.
I'm talking about it's all over America, in every city, in every state fair. It's not just the pride parades. It's everywhere. Nobody in America wants to say you can't do that because they'll be sued from hell to breakfast and wind up being broke from the lawsuits. Conservative politicians won't stand up to it because they'll get completely screwed and sued. So this is today allowed everywhere. There's an English aristocrat 120 years ago that said, I don't care what you do in the privacy of your own home. I'm a libertarian. I don't care about what you do in private. This woman, I forget her name, you can Google it. She said, I don't care what you do in the privacy of your home. As long as you don't do it in the streets and scare the horses. They've been doing it in the streets and scaring the horses for 30 years, as we know. Buck naked men, genitals hanging out, cod pieces with 4 foot long exaggerated genitalia in front of the public, including children, everywhere, right now. Now, they said diversity, tolerance, acceptance. We had that 30 years ago because most Americans really don't want to think about it or hassle anybody. Most Americans are roughly libertarian at heart. But what we've got now is a movement that is about cultural supremacy. They're not about acceptance. They're about running every institution, every public thing, everything involving grooming children from preschool on. They're about cultural supremacy. And as Breitbart said, culture is determinative. Various brilliant thinkers, Marx said economic determinism. Well, Marx was wrong and he was an asshole, but there is determinism. Since Marx, great thinkers have said, well, it's not necessarily economic determinism, but there is determinism and there is cultural determinism.
There are two pretty, to my eye, pretty fallacious two instruments invented by the left.
Is in fallacy or fellatio? Just kidding.
You pick.
Just kidding.
You pick.
That's a soundbite.
Yes,
anyway, fallacious.
Fallacious.
As in fallacy.
Yes.
As in untruth.
How did I say it?
Sounded close to fellatio.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Let's not beat it to
death.
Anytime you have to explain a joke, it's over. So there are two fallacious principles. What are those?
So one of them, thank you for helping me to state.
Yeah, well, your English can always get better, Yura.
Like everybody else's. But the thing is, one of them is the, I think it was this Soros mentor who said intolerance to intolerance. So in other words, if we are forced to tolerate something, if we become intolerant, they become intolerant.
Well,
So-
that was a radical left motto, but it's also true and should be true for moderate centrists. And we're tolerating too much, so we should be intolerant of leftist intolerance.
So
Let me
that's
shake your
the end
hand
of
for
tolerance,
bringing
right?
that up. Let me thank you.
Yeah, I have
You're
another hand. You're going to shake it in a minute.
import-
Another thing is what's called another language thing. I will
Think about it.
avoid the words that I may mispronounce, but it's what they call intersectionality.
Oh yes, that is the idea.
It's also coming to the end.
And by the way, intersectionality, and I'm gonna address that in 1 second after I give you a little background. The Frankfurt School, which I'm sure you're aware of, goes back to World War II and after World War II. And the Frankfurt School was a bunch of Marxists in Germany that were very smart, but smart people are often dead wrong. And they figured out that the Marxist paradigm of using economic class war wasn't going to work in America, and even had problems in Europe, which was actually fertile ground for Marxism going back 150 years at that point. And what they figured out was to forget about economic class war and turn it into der Kulturkampf, the culture war. And their idea of the culture war was to use everything they could to take down middle class, the basis of American prosperity, democracy, not Democrat Party, but electoral democracy, from the point of view that they would inspire a new generation starting in the 40s and then the 50s to have revolution based on the idea that intersectionality, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and every other ultra disaffected group could join together in a future rainbow coalition of complainers to take down and grow against the successful middle class of America and attack the middle class not on economic grounds, but on hatred grounds, on pure hatred of the middle class. That's the Frankfurt School. So what we got now is the sodomites parading in public and grooming our children from preschool on, taking impressionable youth, which are by definition impressionable. I mean, prone to all kinds of neurosis, and that's assuming they're not mentally screwed up from messed up families, blended families, single parent families, illegitimacy. They're vulnerable. Even kids from happy two-parent families
Every
are
kid
vulnerable.
by definition is vulnerable.
They're all vulnerable.
It's a young
And that's
young
why
flower. Think young flower.
that's why they've been protected for hundreds of years in the school system with good values, mostly Christian, but even in other faiths, schools, they've been protected from the things that can confuse them. Now all over America, every school, because of the goddamn UFT, the United Federation of Teachers, which is Marxist by definition. Every teacher's college in America doesn't teach teachers how to teach better math, better English, better science, better anything. They're indoctrination zones for cultural Marxism. And it's for a point. That goes back to the Frankfurt School. They've been doing this for 60 years. So now, our teachers in America are indoctrinators to fuck up our children's minds And the best thing they got now is this trend that is backed up by the pop music scene from these ugly women with wigs on they have pop songs that the kids listen to at 8 years old that are basically doing satanic rituals, which is part of what LGBT is all about. The horns on the heads. I don't have to go into it. It's been front and center at Super Bowl halftime for 10 years. And if you can't see that that's the top of the pop culture, then you might as well just not listen to me or us. So anyway, what they've got now is a complete cultural system. I mean, Disney non-stop Satanism. This latest Disney show is about a teenage girl that gets impregnated by Satan. Literally. I can't make this up. 10, 20 years ago, if I said this is happening right now, nobody in America would believe me if I said it. But this is now. Disney, by the way, Fortune 500 company, probably a top 10. Disney top management has been the highest rate of sodomites in their top management going back 30 years or longer. Disney World in Florida has had quietly, the public doesn't know it, going back 30 years, Thursday nights, all night long, sodomite bacchanalia, of literal Sodom bacchanalia, public not allowed. Disney World doesn't allow drinking in most areas. During all night long sodomite bacchanalia, going back over 30 years, unlimited drinking, poppers, the drug detritus. The employees have to clean it up, and it fills up not just waste buckets, but dumpsters.
Talking about the amusement park?
Yes, Disney World amusement park. For 30 years, Thursday nights is gay night. It has been for 30 years. They go crazy. Orgies, Saturnalia, Satanism, all night long. You know, they shut the park down to the public and they just turn it into gay disco night. For 30 years. It's a fact. It's provable. Well, that's Disney. That's Disney's management. And this is a company that's been in charge of putting most of what the children of America see day in, day out for decades. It's a fact. I get emails on my Substack and my website from Americans that say, oh my God, my kids are watching Disney and Nickelodeon, and they've got transvestites and they're grooming sexual dysmorphia all day long. Well, enough of that. This is just what it is. America has to push back. Families have to push back. Boycott Disney. For instance, they put that nasty, ugly thing masquerading as a female, as if, I mean, that thing thinks it's like Audrey Hepburn. And it, whatever the fuck it is just a displaced, nasty, bad simulacra of a teenage girl insulting teenage girls with the way it acts is just stupid shit.
Acted out by
a grown, skinny sodomite that acts like it's a teenage girl. And teenage girls are actually smarter than that. But that's what's being foisted off. Now, big mistake for the ad and marketing idiots at Bud Light. Big mistake for the top management of Budweiser and whatever the international Fortune 500 company was, of allowing the marketing people to be hired that would then lose $1 billion for the shareholders.
No, it's like 30 billion.
It's an enormous amount of money for the shareholders of a public company. Well, that's a good sign for the future, because the public can boycott. They can boycott.
That's how they
Bud Light. They can. There's only one problem with Fortune 500 companies losing money from bad decisions, and that's that the boards of these companies are stacked with the proxy votes of BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street that own enough of the proxy votes of every single Fortune 500 company. So that every single Fortune 500 company answers to whatever's named Fink at Vanguard and BlackRock and the rest of them. They say, do ESG, do EID, do all this stuff, and we'll reward your management. Even if you lose money. Because Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street are subsidized by the deep state and the globalists at the WEF. And they will reward management even if the Fortune 500 companies lose money from pushing all of this nonsense. They can have bad quarters. 10, 15, 20 years ago, top management at a Fortune 500 company was absolutely terrified of a bad quarter because they'd lose their jobs. So they really wanted to make profits.
Right.
It was argued 20 years ago that that's a problem, short-term thinking. We don't even have short-term thinking anymore. They answer to the proxy votes of the hedge funds. Once again, evil, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, because those guys are subsidized by the deep state and globalists to achieve an agenda. So these companies, top management can lose money with impunity. They'll keep their jobs because they're fucking subsidized by U.S. taxpayers. This is not capitalism. Capitalism is a terrible word. Capitalism comes from Marx, who coined the term to imply that the only winners in market economies are the people with capital, which is a lie. The winners in market economies are the participants in entrepreneurial free market activities, proven, every honest economist has said for 200 years. Going back to Adam Smith, but more recently, market economies work to the degree that they're not crony-based and not politically influenced.
Listen, factories, multi-storied buildings existed in ancient Rome, in ancient Greece. All this organization of human labor, look at the pyramids, look at the temples, look at the schools in Asia Minor that were manufacturing beautiful sculptures on commercial scale for all the temples in the Hellenistic world.
That was not Marxian capitalism.
There was no Marx around. There was no the word capitalism.
As close to free market as the classic societies could get. The bottom line is that free markets work. The Marxian idea of, quote, capitalism, unquote, is a slur on the free market because it implies that only the asset holding class can win in the free market. It's a lie. Adam Smith said it, and he was right. And since then, every honest economist has amplified Adam Smith's point about the invisible hand of the market. All Listeners, please look up Adam Smith and the Invisible Hand. Now, where were we? What were we talking about before we got to this market issue? I'm sure we were talking about the slurs against the market. Well, let's go back.
I was talking about I made a big jump back to ancient history.
Sure,
just
but
to
where were we
mention that
before
the human labor was organized in a way so it would be most effective, where there were factories producing famous Greek vases.
Ancient civilizations allowed for entrepreneurialism.
Built by it. Yes,
indeed. Now, where were we as far as what we're talking about with the cultural Marxism, feminism, and the
I can tell you.
Please remind me.
Just to link it to the last chapter for our planned conversation. I was talking about this capitalism before capitalism, and it was all built on what was considered then family values and the organization of society, not in a big numbers like of people necessary to accomplish the building of a pyramid, for example, or to travel
or
around
Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which goes back 10,000 years or more. Yeah, humans were accomplishing huge building projects that we're just discovering now all over the world.
But spirituality was there in this or other form.
I'm not quite ready to go back to the wisdom of the ancients. I'm still criticizing right now the damage done to America by the sodomite movement, its destruction of education, and ultimately what that means is that Frankfurt School cultural Marxism was designed to destroy American family structure in order to destroy the economy and in order to destroy American democratic electoral systems and American sovereignty in favor of a globalist, which is what the WEF wants, power over America, because America is the last bulwark from a global, centralized, but Western Europe is already screwed up by 25 years of the EU, which has no electoral system at all. It's what's left is America. They need to destroy America and any democratic electoral system where the people can change the government, which we've started losing since 2020 because Trump won and they hijacked the election. So we've got this pathetic geezer, loser, mentally brain dead puppet of Obama with all of Obama.
In every other faction.
That's the regime we've got.
That's why they cannot
and the permanent
together.
Government of DC, the deep state, which is really run by the globalists over at the WEF, wants to end any possibility of new governments in America. And so far, they're winning. Now, the subject of what to do about that is another story. But all I can say is that American citizens have to push back the only way they can for now, which is to boycott, pull their kids away from the bullshit, homeschool if necessary, if possible. But now let's get to the bigger picture, the wisdom of the ancients. And that is the very ancients, as far as Western Civ, not Asia, although Asia is very interesting and I'd like to talk about it. But we're talking about Western civilization. And the Zoroastrians were the first monotheistic religion. Most people have never heard of them. They were in Western Persia into Eastern Iraq. Their religious influence goes all the way to Eastern Turkey, and they were the first monotheistic religion. They were a dualistic religion. They believed in the conflict of good and evil. When the Hebrews got dragged over to Babylon, whatever it was, 2,500, 3,000 years ago, the Hebrews were influenced by the Zoroastrian influence in Babylon. The Hebrews were monotheistic, but the Hebrews picked up a lot of Zoroastrian dualistic thought. The Zoroastrians go back, according to archaeology, 5,000 years ago. And the Zoroastrians had in their documented theology the flood myth and all kind. By the way, the flood myth is almost universal, going back 5,000 years ago. Everybody can look this up. Many of the elements of the Hebrew Old Testament are shared by many other religions and philosophies all over the world, because there seems to have been a flood that affected a lot of parts of the world going back almost 5,000 years. So the Zoroastrians are interesting because I consider them to be the as in U-R, with an umlaut over the U, classic civilization. Scholars say they influenced the Hebrews. They influenced the Old Testament. They were monotheists, and they believed in the battle between good and evil. They also...
Are you conflating the Manichaeans and Zoroastrians?
The Manichaeans were separate, but they were an offshoot of the Zoroastrians. They came from a little farther north among the equivalent of the Scythians of the time, over by the west side of the Caspian Sea. You can look it up. The Manichaeans, in fact, were big influence in Rome. After Rome, by the year 350, became
Money was
Christian.
done by the beginning of the 4th century.
Saint Augustine, before he had his Augustinian conversion to Christianity, studied in Rome. He was already very well educated from Carthage and Tripoli, but he wasn't a Christian devout yet. You brought up the Manichaeans, who were an influence on St. Augustine before he became a devout Christian and then a saint from Carthage and wherever in North Africa. The Manichaeans were also a dualistic religious philosophy like the Zoroastrians, and Augustine rejected them in favor of Christianity as it existed in his day and age, and became the leading intellectual, philosophical, theological light of his day. Now, I admire Augustine because he had a profligate youth. He was a gambler, probably did the equivalent of drugs and orgies before he became a saint. And I kind of like to want to emulate him. But that's not the point. Where we're at is the wisdom of the ancients. The Zoroastrians, the Hebrew Old Testament, the Egyptian, particularly Akhenaten, monotheistic sun god, and then the classical Greeks and the Romans who descended from classical Greek theology, etc. Now, Greeks and Romans were initially pagans, they became Christians.
But here's the point about the wisdom of the ancients. Every one of these societies in the Western world, from Zoroastrians who were North Iran, Caspian, all the way west, this doesn't apply exactly to Asia, but all these classical societies understood one simple thing: family structure. They all needed family structure with offspring, and I will posit that they needed offspring because they knew they needed to breed warriors to defend their turf. Certainly, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans knew they needed offspring. They knew they needed stable family structures. And what wisdom of the ancients did they have? They needed to control the sexuality of young women. Now, you can say, what about men? Well, men's sexuality control ain't gonna happen. These are warriors. They got testosterone. You can control them through societal, cultural limits. But what's uncontrollable, unless it's seriously controlled, is the hormonal attractiveness of adolescent, menarchical young girls at the peak of their beauty. Because unless you control them, you're going to drive all the men wild in society, and then you won't have stable family structures. And you need stable family structure. What we've lost in the last 70 years is, because of feminism and LGBT, is any moderation of the sexual behavior of young women. Now we'll get to very, very quickly the classic paradigm of the virgin whore myth that's been with us for a couple thousand years, back to the wisdom of the ancients. It's either a virgin or there's a whore.
It comes all the way back to...
It goes all the way back
Babylon
to everything you know. And there's a reason for that. Because it's part of what's kept young, menarchical girls in line, their families, the whole culture. To the point of death. If you don't keep your virginity and get married a virgin, we're probably going to kill you in the classic civilization. Well, there's a lot to be said for that. Because today's culture is all about letting young menarchical, meaning, early bleeders, if you will, running rampant, being rappers and whatnot, just expressing themselves and sacrificing their virginity early in life. When what you want for family structure is back to the wisdom of the ancients. Marriageable girls, preferably being virgins. Virgins, very important. I mean, I'm still ready to get married to a hottie, preferably a virgin, preferably that hasn't taken the death shot and is shedding spike proteins at me, but that's another story. Anyway, that's the wisdom of the ancients. It comes down, in terms of the sexual revolution going back 5,000 years, control of decent sexuality among young women particularly, and women in general. Now, I know we're in a hurry to get out of here, so I'm going to jump to the last part. I don't consider the goddamn Muslims to be wisdom of the ancients. Because I think that goddamn Muhammad was a Satanist, and whatever book of garbage he came up with is absolute fucking garbage. If I had a copy of it right now, I'd tear out a page and wipe my ass with it, and I'd take the rest of it and I'd light it on fucking fire. The best thing I can say about the goddamn Muslims is that they kind of know how to keep their women in line in the countries they control. Do not turn that off. They know how to keep their women in line, although it's not the way I'd keep my women in line. But they know how to keep their women in line. And every feminist and every LGBT motherfucker should be all over the Muslims, pushing them out of Western Civ, because the Muslims cut the clits off women. It's called a clitorectomy. It's also called female circumcision. It's also called FGM, female genital mutilation. They do it now in their countries. They do it here in America, in their areas where they're like Detroit, and you know what I'm talking about. They do it all the time. Furthermore, the Sodomites have their issues, and Sodomites are basically pedophiles because they're narcissists. They generally love little boys because they're trying to recapture some craziness with little boys as their sex objects. I got that. I understand it. It's not cool with me, but it's what they do.